In this presentation, I'm going to go ahead and argue that gender oppression developed as a result of a long series of adaptations and divisions of labor made through thousands of years, seen as necessary for changing social and economic conditions, rather than um, the many of the theories commonly shared by Western anthropologists, feminists, and conservatives alike, which are all rooted in some kind of biological determinism. And just a recap here, biological determinism is a very flawed idea or concept that all of our behaviors are innate to us, and predetermined by genes, brain size, or other biological or physiological attributes. And this theory is majorly flawed because it denies the existence of free will, or that social, economic, or maybe cultural factors have any kind of influence over the way that we act or like certain human characteristics. Um, so I'd like to make this argument by going through a quick history, or probably not really quick, by a pretty long history of the origins of gender oppression, more specifically, the origin of the oppression of women. And I'm going to do this by going through the development of class society, arguing that gender oppression and class society developed basically hand in hand alongside each other. And therefore, it's most likely that all genders were complicit in the development of gender oppression. And of course, these arguments were formed using a Marxist material perspective, which is not based on mere speculation or conjecture, but a perspective based on what we mostly, or what I mostly know about the development of society and relationships to the means of production, and a little bit of conjecture and speculation. And additionally, I would like to provide reasons for why making these arguments is not something that should be seen as frivolous or unnecessary, which I hear this a lot when we make these presentations, mostly by people with bad arguments and horrible strategies. But I want to make the argument for why these arguments are absolutely necessary to make. Actually, they're critical in our role as communists, because understanding the roots of this oppression provides the political clarity that we need for building strategies to fighting against that oppression and ending it from once and for all, which is absolutely necessary in our struggle towards our ultimate goal of total human liberation. So, first of all, let's cover some bad arguments about the origins of gender oppression. The most common myths about gender oppression are that a state of patriarchy has always existed, and that women have always been the victims of this patriarchy by being subjects of male dominance and violence, which I think makes women seem pretty weak. um, the common explanation for this is that either men's psychology or biology, back to the biological determinism, makes them capable of subjugating women, and that they just do so because. Um, and that in the same way, women have, and this is to a lesser extent that I hear this argument, but in the same way, women have just a gentle and caring nature because of biological determinism. And so they are universally some kind of natural victims. And as it goes, by human nature, men have always and universally dominated women since the dawn of humanity. And by this very same logic, gender roles have always universally existed in their current form and are a feature of society. Um, and they are, in fact, dictated by human nature. And evidence for these assumptions largely lies in non-objective and flawed anthropological studies, and many of which are unsurprisingly tainted with male chauvinism and sexism. And they contain hasty and sweeping generalizations, and they were flawed by trying to apply modern standards when examining societies and cultures of the past. And they've contained confirmation bias, and at worst, they contained absolutely no evidence at all, just facts completely pulled out of somebody's asshole. Um, so However, more modern and unbiased anthropological and archaeological research, and even really modern data science modeling, so math put on top of anthropological studies, proves that this is probably false, mostly, and seems to show that for the majority of human existence, around 200,000 years, and maybe as far back as 400,000 years ago, the sexes were practically egalitarian, because there weren't even strict gender roles at all, and probably there's actual evidence that supports there may not have been any gender really at all. And this anthropological research has been reproduced, like I said, in data modeling scenarios. But in my research, I found that a lot of people are allowed to just speculate in this field a lot. So my speculation is that this is how it happened, because to me, this is what makes the most logical sense. So a 2015 University College of London study led its researchers that participated in the study to believe that sexual equality might have actually assisted with the evolution of the earliest human species, because it would have promoted a wider swath of sexual partners to choose from for all the genders or biosexes at that time, which not only sounds absolutely amazing, but that would have meant that there was less inbreeding, and this would have led to not only viability of the species because of less genetic issues, but also greater innovation and the spread of useful technologies. And it would have promoted cooperation and the spread of societies throughout geographic areas in general, all of which would have promoted viability and the success of the species. Often feminists and chauvinists alike point to male dominance in animals, like similar species of humans, as proof to their arguments that of like the innate aggression of males over females. But the same study here seems to suggest that equality amongst the sexes may be what actually distinguishes humans from other similar species, and the existence of hierarchies and aggressiveness against one sex from the other has barred innovation and the development of technologies. And that may actually be what has hindered any further evolutionary development within those similar species. So like the missing link almost. So it's notable that both sexes contributed in these early nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, and there were divisions of labor probably, but all jobs were seen as equally important. And this is a little bit contrary to Ingalls' work, early work, but some studies seem to show us that the division of labor was probably way more varied than common perception, like even Marxist perception, and may have been distributed more so by age, ability, and experience, and not just sex or gender or anything like that, which makes the most sense if you think about it, because there's evidence to show that there was little distinguishment between gender according to like biosex or anything. So neither sex was just confined to hunting or gathering, as these roles would have likely been distributed amongst all who were capable of doing those roles, and they would have been seen as equally as important as well. And this is a period of what Ingalls referred to as primitive communism. And I just want to point to animals right now, like as the other research, just to pose the question of huge differences in physical attributes attributed to common gender norms in biosex, like brute strength and muscle mass and things like that, like capabilities. Like certainly these differences increased and became much more distinguishing or pronounced based on the division of labor associated with each sex as well. And they can't just be attributed just to biological determinism. Like there had to be more equality here as well. Back in this period of time, because scientific evidence suggests like a general lack of gender conformity or just outright nonconformity for thousands of years. So like, did these physiological attributes actually become more diversified after there was more of division of labor? That's my question. So these nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes traveled out of necessity. And as the food sources would dry up, they would travel until they found another food source. And this was still a generally egalitarian period of time within those primitive communal tribes or whatnot. Like sometimes there was conflicts between the different societies, like over the food source, but within the commune itself, there was egalitarianism generally. So there was not like a surplus of food to distribute or any private property, so to speak of. There would have been personal possessions most likely, but nothing more than what they could carry around with them as they were nomadic and what was necessary to keep each other alive during that travel time. Things, labor such as childcare was most likely shared and communal. And so the concept of the nuclear family definitely did not exist yet. And the number of children that they would have was limited to the number that the commune could carry with them as they would travel. And I'll let you think about that for a minute as it relates to reproductive choices and freedom. So around 40,000 to 20,000 years ago, innovation increased and technologies got better, and these tribes began to work the land at least seasonally. And this is earlier than what Engels talked about in his work, I believe, and what a lot of Marxists used to talk about, or anthropologists used to normally agree on. And so like this seasonal settlement and this changed everything. Surpluses of food were produced for the very first time, at least transiently or temporarily, for temporarily seasonal, I guess, settlements. So it was like a combination of nomadic lifestyle and just settlement lifestyle, like transitioning into the Neolithic era. And at this time, surpluses of food were produced for the very first time, and certain trusted people, and this would have included all genders, including women, bio women, they would be placed in charge of planning and distribution of this surplus food supply. And certain trusted people would have included like religious people, elders, certain people like I can't really, we don't really know in general, but I would just speculate certain trusted people. However, this did not result in the formation of class antagonisms for thousands of years. Like it did not immediately result in class society, and certainly not antagonistic class society. So this begs the question, if society was mostly egalitarian up until this point, how is it that men actually came to dominate other genders? How did gender roles become a thing in an antagonistic class society? And how do we explain oppression without falling back on just another form of biological determinism? Certainly the other genders did not just give up all of their status because of, biological qualities or inherent biological qualities. And likewise, certainly men did not just dominate other genders at this point due to biology. And so I think this is kind of where social reproduction enters the argument a little bit. And it's essential to emphasize how all of this was an extremely dialectical process, abracadabra, that developed over the thousands of years, and no one observer could just sit back and like observe this, from their perspective all at once. No one person would have been able to detect this happening. So additionally, I think we should mention that all genders would have played a role in these decision-making processes that would have accumulated over a long period of time. So there was never like a point in time where men just consciously decided to play a dominant role over the other genders or prey over them, or where one class decided to just rule over another class. Like there's not just a board of capitalist directors sitting in the sky and making these decisions consciously. That would be just a really highly simplistic view of how these dialectical processes like accumulate over thousands and thousands of years. And that's just not how it works. So in nomadic societies, as I mentioned earlier, the number of children was limited to the number that the group could carry. And I said to just think about what that means, and I'm not going to go into it, but I'll, as humans started to settle down and work the land more, there was nothing to prevent increasing birth rates. In fact, more children generally meant more labor to produce towards the surplus and more bodies to contribute towards a growing population, which was good and necessary to a burgeoning society's success. And so it follows that in this new developing epoch, all genders agreed that it was in society's best interest to restrict some activities during pregnancy and post-pregnancy care just for the safety and viability of offspring, and that promoted societal growth and production and innovation and collaboration, cooperation, and new technologies. And through these developments, a new division of labor was established, and again, not consciously and not immediately, through thousands of years of developments. And so this was attributed to biological sex, but through like social developments to the means of production, not innate biological qualities. It was based on who or could or would reproduce offspring, but not on biological sex alone. This is likely where society started to gradually shift focus towards male lineage because it made more sense in the context of production, and also where gender differences may have been more apparent, but there were still egalitarian societies in general. But so somewhere within these historical developments, in order for a minority exploitative ruling class and a majority working class to emerge, the people that were put in charge or charged with controlling the surplus, which up until this time was still egalitarian in principle, they would have had to somewhere along the line, and again, thousands of years of accumulated developments, not just all at once and not consciously, they would have had to just somewhere began to usurp what was in the best interest for the society as a whole for that of their own best interests. And this is where another change occurred. And as the interest of those in charge of the surplus no longer aligned with those in charge of production, which was the majority, of course. The majority was in charge of laboring the land, while a small minority planned and distributed. That division became antagonistic towards each other. And to reinforce this contradiction, for a ruling class, a minority ruling class, to elevate their position and exert their authority as a minority over a majority of the people and prevent themselves from being constantly resisted and overthrown, unique measures needed to be put into place. Because through every step of this development, class society was in fact met with resistance. When the struggle escalated, the majority would rightfully tell these so-called rulers to eat shit, resist, rebel, and sometimes even overthrow this ruling class. And the majority would rightfully take over and divide up the surplus amongst themselves in what was the best interest of society. And I think this is about the only thing that is actually human nature, because it goes against human nature for the majority of people to just let themselves be exploited by a simple minority. So how did a ruling class finally emerge and become able to maintain this kind of exploitative relationship over a majority of the people that were laboring the land and producing the surplus? And again, I want to emphasize a long process, accumulated changes. But mainly, this was done through ideology, religion, development of the state, and its codifications that were meant to limit and suppress the majority, which were included in enforcing oppressive gendered divisions of labor and reinforcing different gendered roles. So the oppression of women and other oppressive measures developed out of necessity over the course of thousands of years, where antagonistic classes emerged. So prior to these develops, as I have mentioned many times already, societies were mostly egalitarian, and communal within. So we can assume that children in childcare would have been communal activities. There was likely no monogamous relations within these primitive communist societies, because why would there have there wouldn't have needed to be at this point. That just wouldn't have made sense. And because as I mentioned earlier, as societies transitioned from nomadic to settled lifestyles, the amount of viable offspring was directly correlated to the success of each society because of the capacity of productive forces and the ability to innovate and create useful technology, not consciously, but through the emergence of antagonistic classes, the need for the ruling class to establish a lineage arose, which was certainly harder to establish through the maternal line and non-monogamous relationships where children in childcare were seen as communal shared responsibility. And so out of necessity to maintain power, the paternal lineage superseded maternal lineage in importance, leading to the reinforcement of gender roles, which ultimately led to the subjugation and dominance of women, harsh control over a woman's sexuality so that no one could question that lineage and the claims to inheritance. Women were subject to monogamous lifestyles, and it's important to note that men were not. Reproductive freedoms were often limited, and from these processes, the nuclear family developed. However, I want to point out that all genders would have been involved in every step of the way and represented in probably both classes, much like women and queer folks contribute to their own oppression a lot of the times today. Since the very dawn of class society, the concept of the family has changed, but it has always been a source of gendered oppression. So it's somewhat misleading to assert that women's oppression or gendered oppression emerged only with the emergence of private property via the simplistic explanation of men's dominance of the surplus through brute strength and coercion, or with the simple explanation that when the Neolithic era arrived and humans were capable of accumulating surpluses, that classes just developed and men oppressed women because they could handle the heavy tools and were able to dominate the domestication of animals, or other simple explanations, because this seems to just rely on the same basic arguments as biological determinism, just shoved down the road a few thousand years later. And it doesn't make much sense when factoring in science asserting much more gender neutrality or nonconformity and different knowledge about the divisions of labor. And it makes much more sense and is more likely that women's oppression evolved dialectically from changing socioeconomic relations to the mode of production via the role in social reproduction. However, Engels' fundamental premise was 100% correct, and he absolutely nailed it in The Origin of the Family and Private Property in the State when he argues that the overthrow of the mother right was the world historical defeat of the female sex. But it's key to note that both sexes played central roles in the development of this defeat, and as well as the resistance to it at every step of its development, because it suited their interest in these struggles, not out of human nature. And as I just mentioned, women are still consistently participating in and benefiting from the oppression of other women. So, in the early stages of industrialization and capitalism, the working class family almost became non-existent, as all members of the newly formed proletariat who had just been plucked off the lands and violently encroached within the commons, forming the new proletariat, spent too many long hours in the city factories and mills. So having every man, woman, and child working 24/7 was highly effective for increasing capitalist bottom line, but it was not so conducive to maintaining a healthy labor force to pluck warm bodies from, which began to decline and actually kill off these warm bodies without any further replenishment. And so in order to adapt to this discovery, there was suddenly a resurgence of the nuclear family and the nuclear family values as a sense of not only, social reproductive force capabilities, but also of social stability. The proletariat sought comfort from their alienation and their shitty, crummy lifestyle and conditions in the concept of the nuclear family. And the capitalists did what they do best. They capitalized off of this shit by further reinforcing strict gender roles and the oppression and regulation of women's private and reproductive freedoms to reinvigorate the labor force and boost the shit out of the productive forces. In fact, women's roles in the labor force has adapted and changed several times throughout recent history, largely because women are used as the capitalist class personal temp agency, as in we are allowed to work when necessary and as required for capitalists' own profitability. World War I and II are prime examples of this. Women worked in male-dominated industries while men ran off. Well, they were forced off to fight in the rich people's wars. However, women were paid less. And, when those wars ended, we were largely sent home. Once they came back, we've all seen A League of Their Own with Madonna. Additionally, since the 60s, there has been a wave of progressive movements in regards to alternative families, adoption rights, marriage equality, queer rights, and a lot of social stigmas have began to seemingly disappear until recently with these wacky conservatives in the United States. Single mothers and divorced families are now somewhat accepted, and men, they kind of contributed to more of the reproductive labor within the family, but the fundamental structure of the family is still inherently the same because capitalism has adapted generously to uphold the essential tools of social stability and reproduction found within the nuclear family. Capitalism forces the nuclear family on us all with its hegemonic ideology through religion, education, media, politics, you name it. And this continues to reinforce gender roles. So women especially, but queer folk to some extent as well, just in a different way, are both socialized and put at a material financial disadvantage and conditioned to look for and depend on a monogamous partner in order to survive in this fucked up reality. The nuclear family helps to maintain social and financial stability as well as control over the working class. Additionally, the nuclear family provides the social reproductive labor necessary, and we've already talked about this a little bit, just to replenish the working class so that they don't have to invest in any of the things that are typically done by the lowest paid employees of society. Unpaid reproductive labor has been historically seen as inherent to women, women's nature, and disproportionately so for women of color and immigrants. And the United States and other first world countries habitually prey on people of the global majority, especially women of the global majority, for labor to do these roles that no one wants to do. So even when women aren't a part of a traditional family and aren't performing this type of labor at all, the predominant ideology of our society is still pretty sexist and misogynistic around women and queer folks' responsibility for these roles, and has deemed queer folk and women to be society's punching bags, society's incubators, sexual harassees, rapies, perpetual victims of violence. They have deemed us to be both passive and patient while simultaneously being bitches, nurturing, babysitters, housekeepers, teachers, therapists, cooks, the overall home economics coordinators, certified public accountants, professional mediators, EMTs, certified paralegals, and so much more. So Ingalls' analysis of the nuclear family was completely accurate for the most part, the premise, because it has in fact, the nuclear family has in fact led to rampant systemic equality. When people enter the workforce, they're likely to seek opportunities in accord with their socialization, and jobs aligned with reproductive labor and public service are often the lowest paid jobs in society. Additionally, women in nuclear families often work less hours just because their jobs happen to be the lower paid source of income of the two jobs in that family, or the two primary sources of income in that family between the man and the woman, or the two partners in the family if it's alternative. And therefore, their job is given less priority within that family. So if a kid gets sick, they're the one who has to take time off or whatnot, which leads to only part-time work for them. allowing her to do more of the unpaid labor at home in comparison to her counterpart. And in turn, it makes her more financially dependent on her partner, and it lowers her overall lifetime wage earnings. And that further increases the overall wage gap. Women are often paid less due to just having to take time off for maternity leave and childcare reasons. And lower wages for women means lower wages for every worker. Bosses use our lower wages as a justification to lower everyone's wages, and especially in certain industries dominated by women. So in today's society, women make up around 39% of the global workforce and over half of US's workforce. That means we have a slight majority over over men in the workforce right now, actually. So globally, women's labor force participation rate is around 50% compared to 80% for men. And it's declined a little bit since COVID. So while women are well represented in today's capitalist workforce, they are hardly relieved from oppression or marginalization or unpaid labor. And as I have thoroughly explained, this is used to keep workers conquered and divided, and to keep us from fighting against our one true enemy. However, when struggle increases, workers begin to see cracks in the system, and they begin to resist the oppressive forces. And workers have the capacity to completely shut down production by collectively withdrawing their labor, giving them unique revolutionary potential. So this begs the question, does any of the shit coming out of my mouth actually matter? So while this long, complicated history with the additional qualifying statistical information, is any of it important, and why is it important? Many of the people in leftist circles and even in Marxist circles will try to argue that this argument that I'm making is completely unnecessary, and especially unnecessary to fighting against this ideology. Like it's a chicken versus the egg argument, which came first? And that others in the working class don't care about the roots of oppression. So it's pointless to make these arguments or even have these discussions with others in the working class. And I would argue that A, you need to reevaluate and appreciate your audience. B, once you do that, these arguments may seem more necessary and critical. And C, don't discount the entire working class based on vacillating ideologies held within the working class. And D, it's absolutely within the material interests of the entire working class to dismantle all oppression, and understanding the roots of that oppression is the logical first step to building the best strategies for doing so. Like, you wouldn't attempt to find a cure for cancer without investigating what the root cause of that cancer was first. That would be absolutely preposterous for me to make that suggestion. So how is this any fucking different? So even if our target audience for these arguments is not the entire working class, but just a small sector of the most advanced and resilient working class, or the most political part of the working class, and so it's not the entire working class, we're still targeting a very specific sector of the working class with these arguments for strategic political discussions. And I think that still means that there's a vital importance to learning about this history and learning how to clarify and make these strategic, pertinent arguments. So just a disclaimer here now, by no means can we reduce this argument to class alone. And by no means are these types of arguments or any historical material analysis, by that means, used to excuse chauvinist men, misogyny, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, gender oppression, or any of those things from the thousands of years of oppression people have had to face, the actual oppression that they have had to face, or the oppression that people currently face. That is all inexcusable. And the fact that is that while the origins of oppression may be socioeconomic or a social construct or socially constructed, that doesn't mean that gender oppression or oppression in general is non-existent. The ideology that these socioeconomic relations cause is very much real, and the harm it causes is very, very real. Women and queer folks face discrimination, violence, harassment daily. Not only that, but they face ideological pressure to fit into ridiculous gender-conforming roles, which are continually socialized, reinforced every day, all throughout society. And the pressure is like I can feel it right now. It's terrible. It's mind-numbing. It's overwhelming. So this is not to give the ideology of patriarchy, sexism, chauvinism, etc. a pass. And just to answer my question, of course it matters. Like, of course these arguments matter. However, as I said already, the roots of gender oppression are very important for us to understand so that we can develop the strategies to end this oppression once and for all. Being ambivalent about the idea, about ideas, like terrible ideas, like biological determinism or human psychology leading to, it leads to just hegemonic ideology or general consensus building around the idea that things like patriarchy and certain oppressions are just part of human nature and have always universally existed or been here, or maybe that God started these ideas or something like that. And the logical conclusion from believing these things is that it can be impossible to fight these things because it's impossible to fight against human nature, or that these atrocities must have always existed so that they're going to always exist, which the worst case from this would be the logical conclusion of acceptance or actual subservience by marginalized populations without any kind of solutioning at all. And the best case, I think, would be suggesting liberal strategies of trying to impose our individual will on others by using moral devices or other ideological built arguments, like asking people to treat others the way they want to be treated, the golden rule, or attempts at spirituality or mindfulness, the employing of thoughts and prayers to end oppression, which these things aren't necessarily bad, or, but alone they can't work. They shouldn't be seen as serious strategies that we can rely on. Things like using the Care Bear stare on various members of society until they have their kumbaya moment in a drum circle in Boulder can and will not end oppressive ideology. Another terrible conclusion from this logic is that we can solve this with electoral or identity politics or top-down leadership. Like electing imperialist war pigs, such as Hillary Clinton, into office, or by putting top cops into high positions, like Kamala Harris being vice president, or even putting seasoned leaders like Michelle Obama into high CEO positions, or putting her in charge of NGOs, or giving her all the money in the world to make more NGOs. Those things are not going to work. We know this from experience. And that's part of a material analysis. All of these things cause people to interrupt and dismantle mass movements of working class people with strategies far too focused on voting for elected officials, even seemingly reasonable ones like AOC or Bernie, such as the strategies being consistently employed by the DSA right now, putting too much focus on voting these kinds of people into Congress and the executive branches or other local offices or political entities, relying on trying to reform the system within. And we know that depending on this strategy alone, as our complete and total strategy, is not going to help us rid society of oppression. We've seen it too many times. We've seen the complicity of the Democratic Party be the graveyard of social movements time and time again. So without a material analysis, it's easy to fall prey to reactionary ideas as well, like radical feminism, because they conclude that all gender oppression is inherent to men's human nature in one vast sweeping generalization. And that leads to separatist ideas or reactionary ideas. And this is another necessary logical conclusion, because why would women or queer activists ever allow themselves to fight alongside men if they believe them to be their natural predators? Marxist feminists and communists, that's redundant, first of all, because as Marxists or communists, we're all feminists. And if you don't identify as such, I don't know why you're in this org, or why you're here unless to mock me. But we should not exclude men from feminist struggles, as the struggles are not independent of each other, and we can't succeed independent of each other. I previously mentioned that throughout these dialectical developments, people of all gender identities and classes were complicit in their own oppression. And what this proves is that individual strategies or separate struggles in their own oppression, individual strategies or separate struggles are not effective strategies to overcome what is systemic or societal problems that have developed throughout thousands of years. Instead, we must realize that these struggles are inseparable. The struggle against capitalism is a struggle against gender oppression. It is a struggle against queer and trans oppression. It is a struggle against gender oppression, and it's a struggle against queer and trans oppression, and it's a struggle against women's oppression. So the struggles are not independent of each other, but symbiotic, entangled, and a million other buzzwords that are all synonyms for inseparable, and completely intertwined are these things in an infinite web of exploitation, which lead us down the path to chaos and human destruction if we simply sit by and do nothing but hold hands and sing Kumbaya, making our way to the ballot box. And that's because without these oppressions, their corresponding constructs and ideologies, which include misogyny, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, the state, military, and the police, all the byproducts of the state, the contradictions of class society would never have stood up through the thousands of years of resistance and struggle, and never would have evolved into what is current day capitalism, proving that oppression is inseparable from the exploitation that is the heartbeat of capitalism today. So I'm going to wrap this up right here. As communists, we know damn well that electoral, ideological, and separatist strategies, especially when employed alone or as distractions to actual working class mass movements that put blood and sweat in our streets, we know that these will all inevitably fail, pushing us even closer towards planetary disaster. And it's because none of these strategies work to actually address the fundamental inequalities inherent to capitalism. However, as an organization, the Denver Communists are fighting for a strategy that addresses these fundamental inequalities through organized working class struggle from below. We as communists have to persuade the most advanced and willing sector of the working class to join in our mission of building organizations of highly dedicated and trained cadre, those who are willing to intervene in movements as well as in our communities and in our workplaces, to put forth our strategy of promoting class consciousness and working class solidarity, and ultimately building a revolutionary workers' party. We must be able to intervene and engage with workers to promote our set of politics and to provide our political clarity, especially in moments of struggle. We must be prepared and ready for interventions where we engage and debate others and readily point out to all the cracks in the system, as well as contradictions and antagonisms. But most of all, we must promote the idea of how, as a class, it is in all of our best interest to fight together against all oppressive ideas and forces and end the cycle of exploitation once and for all by destroying all classes, divisions, dismantling capitalism, and building a new communist society, achieving our goal of total human liberation. So if any of what I have to say resonates or sits with you well, or if you're interested in any of this all, please ask a member of the Denver Communist or Firebrand about membership in our organization today. Thank you so much.